Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in 1881 Utah, the widow who turned her boarding house into a trap. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the winter of 1881, in a remote stretch of Utah territory, a lone stagecoach creaked into Juniper Creek Station, a dusty hamlet barely charted on any map. Utah then still existed as a federal territory under the governance structures of the Utah Territory rather than a full state government. Wikipedia, the road through the plateaus was treacherous. High winds, swirling sand, and bitter cold meant travelers often dreaded the final leg after sundown. The proprietor of the boarding house was a widow named Eliza Warren, age mid-40s. Locals knew the place as Juniper Creek Boardinghouse. It occupied a modest two-story wooden frame structure with a sagging porch and shuttered windows. Eliza had arrived in the region a few years earlier, with murmurings in neighboring settlements about a mysterious husband lost on a mining expedition. She presented herself as quiet, reserved, and dignified, always dressed in full morning black, gloves and bonnet, always refusing many guests she deemed unfit. Her house quickly became one of the few safe overnight stops in that isolated corridor. Records from the territorial clerk's office list Eliza as property owner in 1879, taking over the lot after the sudden death of its prior owner, a Mr. Jonas Miller, whose name appears at least once in a coroner's report dated 1878. Rumor among local miners' journals claimed she had paid a sum well above market value. Her reputation in nearby settlements like Cedar Hollow was strictly polite, but shadowed by whispered unease. "She comma," in silence, one entry noted. "Her eyes betray resolve," wrote another traveler. When the stage dropped its passengers at dusk the first night after crossing the Badger Pass, they observed the boarding house lit faintly through curtained windows. The boarders were few, 2 drifters, a merchant's clerk, and a lone widow from a distant town. The clerk, Thomas Kane, later left an affidavit that the widow, Eliza, moved like a shadow among dim halls, never speaking, but greeting guests quietly at the foot of their stairs, with nothing but a nod and a candle. Late that night, one of the drifters, a young prospector named Caleb Young, vanished. His bed lay untouched, his boots remained in the hall. The remaining boarders reported hearing muffled sounds, a distant cough, the squeak of wood planks. Around 2:30 a.m. Kane claimed he rose to investigate, peered down the dark corridor, and glimpsed a figure slipping into a back stairwell. He intervened, but found only a locked door and silence. By dawn, the desert light fell pale over Juniper Creek, and the boarding house looked almost peaceful again, smoke from its chimney rising in a thin, even column. Yet inside, the tension was palpable. When Thomas Kane descended for breakfast, the table was set for 5, not 6. Eliza served without a word. When he asked about the missing lodger, she said only, "He settled his account and left before sunrise." But Caleb's travel pack was still near the door, his coat still on the hook. Within days, Kane rode to the nearest telegraph post in Milford to alert the territorial marshal. The office's logbook from January 1881 lists his complaint under "Stray Suspicious." The entry bears the clerk's note. "Report dismissed. Insufficient proof of wrongdoing. Advise local constable inquiry." In those years, law enforcement across the Utah Territory was scattered, and isolated crimes often went uninvestigated unless they involved mine disputes or stage robberies. A week later, 2 more travelers disappeared, this time brothers en route to Nevada mines. Their horses were later found tied behind the boarding house's corral, saddlebags emptied but intact. A letter from the Juniper Creek postmaster, preserved in a regional archive, recounts the growing anxiety. "The widow's house keeps filling, yet I never see the men ride out again." Eliza maintained her composure before the few neighbors she had. She was seen visiting the church in Parowan once a month, wearing black silk gloves, always with a sealed envelope addressed to Reverend Samuel Hart. That minister's journal, rediscovered decades later, contains a cryptic line. "She brings tithes in silver coin and prays only for mercy to rest upon the house. By spring, the boarding house gained a grim reputation. Locals avoided passing it at night, claiming to hear dragging sounds near the well or faint knocking beneath the cells. Lardor. These were never confirmed, but they persisted in the oral recollections gathered by historian D. L. Beecham in his 1912 survey on early Utah settlements, a document still cited alongside the official records of the Utah Territory, the same source that now anchors many accounts of this case. Kane eventually returned with Deputy Marshal Orson Pike, who noted the property kept in severe order. The widow greeted them politely, allowed them inside, and even served coffee. When asked about the missing men, she replied, "They took the southern road. I pray they found shelter." Pike found no blood, no struggle, and no graves. Still, he recorded one oddity, an iron door in the cellar floor secured by twin bolts. When he requested it opened, Eliza produced a small iron key, but it did not fit. Pike's report ends abruptly. She said the key belonged to her late husband's tool chest. Nothing further found. Recommend closure. Spring turned to a dry, wind-scoured summer in Juniper Creek. Dust settled deep into the window frames of the old boarding house, and wagons passing by began taking the longer northern road to avoid it entirely. The widow, however, seemed undisturbed. She hired a boy from Cedar Hollow to tend her goats, and though he quit within a week, his later statement to the county clerk offers the most chilling detail yet. "She told me never to fetch water from the well after dark, for the ground there is restless." By late July, the deputy's notes had reached the governor's office of the Utah Territory, where they were filed under irregular homicide suspicion. The document exists only in fragments, but it shows how loosely the system worked in that era. The territorial officers had no manpower to revisit remote hamlets, and so the matter was quietly archived, one of dozens dismissed between 1878 and 1884 as unprovable. It was a passing peddler, Joseph Harland, who finally reignited the case. In September 1881, he arrived in Parowan, claiming he'd seen freshly turned earth near a widow's well. Locals didn't believe him until his wagon failed to return. His horse was found days later near the junipers, reins cut clean. A search party was organized by Reverend Hart and two miners, using lanterns and ropes to probe the dry well. They found no bodies, but they did find a narrow tunnel leading toward the cellar foundation. Its entrance was covered by rotted planks, and beneath them, a small iron ring embedded in stone. One man, a miner named McCready, recorded that the air stank of salt and iron, like old blood left to bake. They sealed the opening and rode to notify the marshal once more. When Pike returned, he found the boarding house empty. Dishes lay unwashed, linens folded on beds, and the widow's black dress hung neatly over a chair upstairs. In the parlor, a single candle burned low beside an open ledger listing names and dates, many matching those of missing travelers. No footprints left the house. The horses were gone. Neighbors recalled seeing a dark wagon heading south the night before, its single lamp shrouded with cloth. Beyond that, no trace of Eliza Warren ever surfaced. Her name appeared once more in a freight manifest near Mesquite in 1883, listed as E. Wayne with no given address. Some scholars of the Utah Territory era argue she fled through the old mining routes into Arizona, living under false names, perhaps even running another inn. Others believe she died in the desert, her body never recovered. The well was sealed, the house sold to the county, and for a time the story faded into whispers. Yet letters from later owners tell of nights when the boards seemed to creak under invisible steps, and the well's lid would rattle though no wind was blowing. By 1884, Juniper Creek had become a ghost settlement in all but name. The stage line rerouted westward, bypassing the area completely. A few homesteads lingered, but they told stories that chilled new arrivals. About the widow's well, about the boarding house that no one dared to reopen. County records show the property was auctioned twice and left unclaimed each time. It was finally purchased in 1887 by a cattle trader named Rufus Thorne, who intended to convert it into a relay stop. Thorne's letters to his wife, preserved by descendants, describe an atmosphere of constant disquiet. He wrote, The house sighs in the wind. I have patched the shutters, yet each morning I find dust from the floor disturbed as though someone had walked circles overnight. When he inspected the sealed well, he noticed the earth around it had sunk in by several inches. Perhaps a collapse, perhaps something else. In February 1888, a territorial surveyor, Joseph T. Lang, conducted a routine assessment of old land parcels near Parowan and Juniper Creek. His field notes, archived at the Utah Historical Society, mention unnatural hollows along the creek bed and residual salt leaching through subsoil, probable burial disturbances. These entries, though vague, became the foundation for later claims that multiple graves had existed under or around the Boardinghouse grounds. By then, the Utah Territory had begun transforming under the coming wave of statehood. New settlers arrived, railroads crept closer, and with modernization came a thin layer of forgetfulness. The local newspaper, the Deseret Evening Star, ran a small feature in 1891 under Frontier Curiosities, briefly recalling the mysterious widow of Juniper Creek. They referenced the Utah Territory archives directly, citing the same missing persons list that first raised suspicions, but no investigation followed. Folklore, thou. Gay filled the vacuum where facts failed. Travelers passing near the ruin after sundown reported seeing a faint glow from within, a single candle, flickering behind a boarded window. Children in Cedar Hollow dared each other to whisper her name at the well, believing they'd hear a reply. Local mothers used the tale as warning. Don't wander at dusk. The widow still chooses her guests. Around 1895, Professor Alden Pierce of the University of Deseret made a field trip to document remnants of early settlements. His diary mentions finding an iron-bound door sunk partly into earth, fused with rust, beside a decayed foundation beam. He took a photograph, a grainy daguerreotype now stored in the university's archives, that shows only the edge of a wooden frame and a circular mark in the dirt beside it. Beneath the image, he wrote, "No trace of a house now stands, yet the ground remains disturbed, as though the earth itself remembers." The case faded once more into the territory's expanding history, buried beneath progress and dust. But even as the state of Utah was officially recognized in 1896, travelers still avoided that stretch of road, claiming their horses would shy for no reason when nearing the old path to Juniper Creek. By the early 1900s, Utah had become a state, but the echoes of its territorial past remained strong in the southern reaches. Juniper Creek itself had vanished from most maps, its name reduced to a faint note beside the Parowan Range. Yet stories of the widow's trap persisted in letters, church circulars, and newspaper fragments, the kind of rumor that refuses to die because no one ever confirmed its ending. A local school teacher, Miss Clara Devons, visited the site in 1902 while compiling frontier folklore for a regional exhibit. Her surviving notes, now held in the Salt Lake archives, describe finding portions of brick, charred wood, and a section of iron hinge protruding from dust. She mentions an older man, possibly a ranch hand, who told her he'd once known the boarding house well. His words, "Ma'am, it was a good place once, but she brought the chill. After her, no fire would hold." By this point, the legend had begun merging with other stories from across the old Utah Territory, like the disappearances near the Pony Express trails and unclaimed mining camps swallowed by landslides. People wove fragments together, suggesting that perhaps Eliza Warren had not acted alone, that her husband, presumed dead years earlier, had returned and joined her in her deeds. It was never proven, of course, and no record of his name was ever found beyond that single coroner's report from 1878. Still, each retelling added more unease. Ranchers claimed their dogs refused to drink from the creek downstream. A telegraph operator in Parowan reported faint interference every night around the anniversary of the first disappearance, as though someone tapped the line with metal. These accounts surfaced briefly in small columns or letters to the editor, but always faded back into silence. In 1905, a new mining company attempted to reopen the ridge above Juniper Creek for prospecting. During grading work, One of the crew unearthed what he believed to be a wooden beam and part of a cellar door. Inside lay nothing but silt and stone. The foreman ordered it filled, and the claim folded within a year. Yet a company clerk wrote to a relative that he'd heard whispering from the ground, like wind beneath the soil. As the years passed, even the name Juniper Creek Boardinghouse began to sound fictional, a cautionary tale meant for campfires. But in 1910, a newly published regional history referenced the Utah Territory case file once more, noting 1 unsolved disappearance and 3 unverified burials at or near the site. The brief mention sparked interest among amateur historians who tried to locate the ledger Deputy Pike had once described. No one ever found it. Some claim the record was destroyed when the territorial offices burned in 1899. Others whispered that the ledger was taken, sold quietly, perhaps, to collectors of strange Americana. Whatever the truth, the disappearance of both woman and evidence sealed the case forever in ambiguity. And so, Juniper Creek faded from public memory, leaving behind only stories and the suggestion of disturbed ground. By 1911, the railroad had reached farther south, and a new generation of settlers passed unknowingly across the old trail that once led to Juniper Creek. Few knew what had happened there, and those who did seldom spoke of it openly. The land was being resurveyed for agriculture, its past buried under fences and irrigation ditches. Still, in certain corners of Utah's archives, the widow's name appeared, faint, almost erased, in correspondence between clerks and the Bureau of Land Management, as if someone had tried to trace ownership of the cursed lot. Among those clerks was a man named Ezra Colton. His private diary, discovered decades later in a family attic, contained an entry from April 1911. Inspected parcel 47 near the old creek, soil dry as ash. Found a rusted padlock half buried, stamped J.W. Locals say it belonged to the widow who vanished 30 years past. I believe it once sealed her cellar. Colton never mentioned returning. The story might have died there, another fading whisper of the old Utah Territory, if not for the work of historian Dr. Franklin Ames, who began cataloging frontier disappearances in 1915. His project, Unsettled Trails, Crimes of the Early West, revived the widow's legend. Ames claimed to have located 2 surviving affidavits from 1881, both signed by the same hand, Thomas Kane, the clerk who had first reported the missing drifter. Kane's second affidavit, written several years after the events, contained chilling contradictions. He retracted parts of his earlier statement, claiming that the widow was kind to me more than once, and that I cannot say she did wrong. He added one cryptic sentence: there were others beneath the house, but not as victims. Ames, ever cautious, suggested that Kane may have been coerced or traumatized, yet his notes also mentioned that both affidavits bore traces of salt in the paper fibers. Consistent, he speculated, with long storage underground. Whether this was superstition or forensic curiosity, no one could tell. By 1918, the story had become a topic of academic gossip. Some dismissed it as folklore. Others, particularly those studying settlement-era isolation, viewed it as a psychological case study, an example of how solitude warped moral perception in frontier women. The Deseret Historical Review published a brief commentary titled The Eliza Warren Question, noting how her legend lingers like a half-finished confession of the desert. And then came a curious addendum. In 1920, construction workers repairing a telegraph line near the old Parowan Junction uncovered fragments of what appeared to be a leather-bound book. It contained only 6 surviving pages, badly water-damaged, written in a feminine hand. One entry read, "The cellar holds what the earth will not forget. I am only its keeper." The initials E.W. were faint, but visible. The book was sent to the University of Utah for preservation, where it remains catalogued without provenance. Its authenticity has never been verified. The discovery of that fragment stirred brief excitement among historians, but just as quickly it disappeared into bureaucratic obscurity. The university archives logged it under anonymous 19th-century personal writing, possibly of Utah origin, refusing to make further claims without confirmation. Yet the handwriting comparison, noted in private correspondence between archivist Lydia Trent and Dr. Ames, revealed a near-perfect match with a known sample from the Utah Territory Land Registry, the signature of Eliza M. Warren, 1879. By the early 1920s, the widow's name resurfaced in newspaper retrospectives on vanishing pioneers. The Salt Lake Tribune ran a Sunday feature titled Women of the Lost Frontier, which recounted her case as one of isolation turned to madness. The article included an engraving of a stern-faced woman in mourning garb, standing beside a rough sketch of a 2-story boarding house. Beneath it read the caption, "The widow who welcomed strangers and kept them forever." No mention was made of the evidence found, nor the 6 missing travelers attributed to her legend. But in Parowan, locals remembered. Elderly residents claimed that during long, windless nights, faint knocks could be heard beneath the soil where the house once stood. One farmer, Silas Breck, reported that his plow struck a hollow patch near the site, and when he dug further, he uncovered a small wooden box containing several coins and a woman's brooch. The brooch bore the same initials. E.W. Breck sold the land the next year and moved north. He told the buyer, a man named Lemuel Stokes, that the earth there refuses to rest. Stokes, practical and unsuperstitious, dismissed the tale, but when his young daughter fell ill shortly after they moved in, his wife insisted they leave the property. A family Bible entry from that same year records the line, "Departed Juniper Creek. After many sleepless nights, the ground trembled as if it sighed." Meanwhile, Dr. Ames, still obsessed, published his final study in 1925, Buried Voices of the Utah Frontier. He cited Eliza Warren's case as emblematic of the psychological decay that followed isolation in frontier settlements. Curiously, he inserted a short parenthetical. Sources cross-referenced with Utah Territory legal papers, 1878-1881. His tone, however, was not dismissive. He suggested the widow might have viewed her acts as a form of penance, not cruelty. The journal was scarcely read outside academic circles, but among local historians it revived a fresh wave of curiosity. Visitors once again sought out the ruins of Juniper Creek. Few returned with stories worth printing, save one 1926 letter to the Deseret Evening Star. "We camped near the creek's bend. The night was silent until just before dawn, when the ground beneath our tent thudded once, as if someone below had knocked." No follow-up appeared in later editions. The ruins, by then half swallowed by sand and sagebrush, lay forgotten again. But the name, Eliza Warren, still hovered in regional memory, quietly passed between archivists and storytellers who found her more myth than woman, more echo than history. By 1927, nearly half a century had passed since the last confirmed sighting of Eliza Warren, and yet the story refused to fade completely. In local archives and oral traditions, she was less a murderer and more a haunting, a specter of the frontier itself. Professors at the University of Utah began including her case in lectures about the psychological toll of settlement life, referring again to the Utah Territory records that had first cataloged the mysterious disappearances of 1881. That year, a traveling journalist named Peter Caldwell arrived in Parowan while collecting material for a serialized column called Forgotten Corners of the West. He was warned by townsfolk not to stray south of the ridgeline after dark, but curiosity outweighed caution. In his notebook, later found among his personal effects, he wrote, "The desert wind carries voices near the old creek. The smell of iron lingers, though no forge remains." Caldwell camped near the supposed site of the boarding house for 2 nights. He sketched outlines of a few weathered timbers, a dry well, and a partial stone foundation. On the second night, his note stopped mid-sentence. The following day, his horse returned to Parowan without its rider. A search party found his camp deserted, papers scattered, and one unfinished line on his final page. "She never left the house, she became it." His disappearance was reported briefly in the Salt Lake Herald, which attributed it to heat stroke and disorientation. But among locals, it reignited the whispers that the widow's ground consumed the curious. The sheriff's investigation found no remains, and by official record, the case joined the long list of missing travelers associated with that forsaken bend of the creek. 2 years later, in 1929, a small brush fire swept through the area. Contemporary accounts describe how the flames burned unnaturally slow near the foundation stones, circling the ground as if meeting resistance. The fire left a ring of scorched earth around the well, but the soil within it remained untouched, blackened at the edges, pale at the center. Photographs taken by the local forestry officer show a faint outline in the dirt, resembling a human figure in repose. Most dismissed it as coincidence, but the image has since become one of the most reproduced mystery photographs in Utah folklore archives. In his later writings, Dr. Ames, by then elderly and skeptical of superstition, made a final reference to the widow in an unpublished essay discovered after his death. The case of Eliza Warren reminds us that isolation is its own form of haunting. The land remembers when people forget. With that reflection, the widow's story seemed finally to settle into history, folded between legend and record. Yet even into the 1930s, those who camped near Juniper Creek swore they could hear slow, deliberate footsteps on the packed soil, a sound that faded the closer one came to the old well. To this day, nothing definitive has been found. No bones, no ledger, no proof of crime or innocence. Only an unmarked patch of ground where the desert wind still stirs the dust, and where, some say, the earth never quite rests. The 1930s brought with them the slow encroachment of modernity, paved roads, telegraph poles replaced by telephone lines, and the last remnants of the old Utah Territory fading into state bureaucracy. Yet somehow, amid this progress, Juniper Creek still resisted erasure. Its name lingered in odd places, marginal notes in survey ledgers, weather logs, and even census annotations where clerks had mistakenly listed Juniper Creek District long after the place had ceased to exist. In 1931, a drought swept across southern Utah. The riverbeds cracked, and what little vegetation had survived the years of abandonment withered completely. When the rains finally came that autumn, the flash floods carved new channels through the sediment, exposing fragments of what once lay buried. 2 ranch hands from Panguitch, driving cattle near the old site, discovered a section of stone foundation and what appeared to be the remnants of a cellar door. They pried it open, revealing only empty space beneath, damp air and the faint smell of rust. Word spread quickly through the county. A small team of local officials and a historian named Mabel Cross arrived within the week to document the find. Her field notes, now in the State Historical Archive, describe timbers rotted beyond recognition, iron fixtures fused to earth, and traces of soot along one corner wall. She also recorded an unnerving detail. From within the lower chamber came the steady sound of water dripping, though no well remains nearby. Cross was methodical, not one for superstition. Still, her later correspondence to a colleague reveals hesitation. There is a heaviness here, not of ghosts, but of consequence. I feel as though this soil has kept a secret too long. She arranged for a small excavation, but after the first day, her crew refused to return. They claimed the air underground whispered, though in all likelihood, it was only wind funneled through the cracks of an old foundation. The excavation was never resumed. County authorities ordered the chamber resealed for public safety. The report was filed, stamped, and forgotten, another page in the quiet bureaucracy of a land still half wild. By the time Cross published her final paper in 1933, she wrote of the widow only briefly, treating her more as a symbol of frontier isolation than a living person. The legend of Eliza Warren, she concluded, belongs not to the supernatural, but to the silence of the desert, a silence so deep it teaches men to imagine. Yet when she returned to the site years later, she brought with her a camera. The surviving photograph, though faded, shows the outline of the well's remains under the rising moon. In the foreground, a blurred figure, perhaps Cross herself, stands with her back to the camera. What unsettles viewers, however, is the faint silhouette beside her. It appears distinctly human, yet translucent, as though the desert had momentarily remembered its ghost. The negative remains in storage, labeled simply, Juniper Creek, 1933, unretouched. By 1934, the last living witnesses of Juniper Creek's original years were nearly gone. The desert reclaimed what little remained of the settlement. Grass and sage began to creep back over the forgotten road, and storms flattened what few fence posts still stood. Yet stories about the widow survived in fragments, told quietly in family kitchens, often beginning with, "My grandfather once passed by her house." That same year, historian Mabel Cross received a letter from an aging deputy in Parowan, once the young clerk who had helped process the missing persons reports half a century earlier. His name was Everett Pike, believed to be a distant nephew of the original deputy, Orson Pike. The letter, written in a trembling hand, offered an unexpected confession. "In our family there was always talk that Orson found more than he wrote in his report. My father said he came back from Juniper Creek pale and sickly, muttering about hearing a heartbeat through the floorboards. He never spoke of it again." Cross was cautious, recognizing how oral tradition could bend truth. Still, she filed the letter among her research materials, writing in the margin, "If true, the omission would explain the hasty closure of the 1881 file." She referenced once again the Utah Territory archives, lamenting how incomplete they were, water-damaged, misfiled, some even destroyed in fires or floods. The widow's name appeared only in fragments, a ledger line here, a tax entry there, never enough to tell a full story, yet too much to be mere invention. Later that same year, Cross was invited to give a small lecture at the State Historical Society. Her topic, Forgotten Women of the Frontier. The last 10 minutes of her talk were devoted to the boardinghouse of Juniper Creek. She spoke not of murder or haunting, but of loneliness, how isolation could carve shadows into the mind. Her final words, transcribed from an audience member's notes, were simple. Whether she killed or merely hid, the land itself bears her memory. Some places remember even when people forget. Afterward, several attendees approached her privately. One elderly man, a retired railroad surveyor, said he had once laid track not far from the creek's edge, and that he, too, had heard strange tapping sounds at night. Another woman claimed her mother owned a ring said to have belonged to the widow, a heavy band with a missing stone found near a dry wash in 1908. Cross included neither account in her published notes. She retired the following year and moved north, but the widow's legend continued without her. In 1935, a student researcher attempting to locate the site of Juniper Creek for a geography thesis reported that his compass needle spun erratically near the area, as if disturbed by hidden magnetism. When he dug briefly at the spot, he found a small shard of mirror, blackened by heat. The student kept it as a curiosity. He wrote on the back of a photograph taken that day, "All gone now, but the silence feels alive." It was the last documented visit to Juniper Creek, before the land was finally fenced off as private property. By the winter of 1936, Juniper Creek was no longer listed in any county registry. Whatever records had once borne its name were either absorbed into larger districts or simply discarded. The land fell to private ownership, a cattle concern that used it briefly before abandoning it due to unreliable groundwater. The widow's story, however, lived on in regional folklore, its tone shifting from dread to melancholy. To some, she became a symbol of the unforgiving frontier. To others, a cautionary spirit haunting the edge of civilization. One of the last printed references from that decade appeared in a small pamphlet compiled by the Utah Writers Project under the WPA. Titled Ghost Stories of the Desert Plains, it recounted the tale of a widow who invited strangers to supper and sent them to the cellar. The pamphlet cited early law reports from the Utah Territory as inspiration, noting how many official records mysteriously ceased in the winter of 1881. The tone was folkloric, but the dates were precise, a subtle nod to truth beneath the myth. That same year, a drought again struck the region. Cattlemen returning to inspect the unused property found the earth around the old well had cracked wide enough to reveal a hollow beneath. One foreman, Daniel Cross, a distant cousin of historian Mabel Cross, lowered a lantern and claimed to have glimpsed a narrow tunnel still intact. The air was cold, he told a colleague, like standing beside something that's been waiting. They resealed the gap with stone and clay, making the sign of the cross before leaving. In 1937, the Deseret Evening Star published a retrospective column titled The Disappearing Inns of the Old Utah Territory. Among them was the Juniper Creek Boardinghouse, described as a structure remembered only by rumor, never fully proven to have existed. A single illustration accompanied the piece, a composite drawn from old descriptions showing a plain woman in morning dress holding a lamp at the threshold of a shadowed room. Her face was expressionless, her eyes drawn as hollow circles. Beneath the image, the caption read, "She waits for guests who never leave." That image, crude and haunting, reintroduced the story to a new generation. Schoolchildren whispered about it during dust storms, claiming the widow's boarding house could still be seen on moonless nights, glowing faintly beyond the sagebrush. Farmers dismissed it as superstition, but even they avoided grazing their cattle near the creek bed after dusk. In her later years, Mabel Cross received letters from readers who had rediscovered her earlier work. One from a young historian in Ogden wrote, "I believe the story of Eliza Warren is not about murder, but about memory, how places can absorb guilt." Cross replied only once, "Perhaps. Or perhaps the land learned to keep secrets better than people do." The widow's legend was no longer a matter of fact or fiction. It had become something else entirely, a reflection of the human need to make sense of the unknowable. And so, even as the century turned, the story of Juniper Creek lingered, half record, half whisper, suspended between history and haunting. By 1938, the site of Juniper Creek had been fully reclaimed by the desert. When surveyors passed through that year to chart new grazing allotments, they marked the area simply as unusable, subsidence risk. The boarding house, the well, even the faint wagon ruts leading toward the creek were gone, erased by time and wind. Only a few stones remained in a scattered semicircle, as though outlining a vanished foundation. But the silence around the place continued to invite speculation. The Utah Folklore Society Journal published a paper titled Echoes of the Juniper Widow, written by a young folklorist named Ruth Ellison. She treated the tale not as horror, but as cultural memory, an allegory for the hardships faced by women left alone on the frontier. In her introduction, she referenced the early administrative accounts of the Utah Territory, observing how frontier women often bore the psychological burdens of solitude and unrecorded loss. Yet midway through her study, Ellison admitted something unusual. She had visited the site herself. Her notes described a quiet unlike any I have ever known. No insects, no birds, only wind that never quite arrives. Beneath her entry she added, "I stood where the well once was and felt a faint vibration in the earth, rhythmic, deliberate, and impossibly steady." She later dismissed this sensation as imagination, though the description unsettled her peers. After her article's publication, Ellison reportedly stopped pursuing fieldwork altogether. Her students said she refused to discuss the Juniper Creek visit in later years, calling it a moment that changed how I understood silence. Meanwhile, the story began to take on a second life in local storytelling circles. Amateur historians and newspaper columnists began blending fact with embellishment, describing ghostly lights, phantom voices, or the widow's shadow walking then. Ridge at sunset. But older residents, those who remembered the last families to settle near the creek, spoke differently. They said the place wasn't haunted at all, just empty, in a way that felt alive, as though the air itself carried a memory too heavy to disperse. That same year, a retired constable named James Dyer gave an interview to a student journalist for a university oral history project. His grandfather, he claimed, had once served under Deputy Pike. Dyer said, My granddad told me the widow didn't bury her guests for greed or madness. He said she kept them near so she wouldn't be alone. The ground was her company. The interview, recorded on brittle acetate discs, still exists in the university archives. The sound of Dyer's voice, crackling, hesitant, ends with a long pause and one final remark. They say she's still there, not as a ghost, but as part of the land. Maybe that's what happens when a person's sorrow sinks too deep. For all its variations, the essence of the story remained the same. A woman alone, a house that listened, and a desert that never forgot. By 1939, Utah's historians began compiling the first comprehensive archives of settlement-era disappearances. The Juniper Creek case, though fragmentary, inevitably found a place among them, not as a proven crime, but as an enduring mystery of the old Utah territory. The archivist who entered it into the ledger, a man named Harold Dunn, annotated the record with a simple note. Status: unresolved. All accounts end in silence. That same year, Dunn was contacted by an elderly woman living in St. George, who claimed to have known Miss Warren as a child. Her name was Sarah Blaine, and her letter, preserved in the collection, reads like a mixture of memory and confession. She was not wicked, only strange. She once told my mother that the walls of her house held voices, and she could not let them go. She said she'd buried her husband where the sun couldn't find him, for the earth owed her that much peace. Dunn followed up, but by the time he reached St. George, Mrs. Blaine had died. Her neighbors said she'd been bedridden for months, and often muttered to herself, repeating the phrase, "The cellar knows." Meanwhile, in Parowan, the descendants of the original marshal, Orson Pike, began sorting through his surviving possessions. Among them was a small tin box containing his service revolver, several coins, and a folded scrap of paper. Written in uneven script were the words, "She smiled when I asked to see the cellar." No date, no signature, no context. When news of the note reached Dunn, he appended it to the official file, but refrained from speculation. The line could mean anything, he wrote, but in its brevity lies a kind of confession, or warning. That winter, a new myth began to spread through nearby towns. Children told stories of a woman in black who appeared by the roadside when storms gathered, offering shelter to travelers who never made it home. Ults laughed it off, yet some wagon drivers admitted that in the darker stretches of the Parowan Road, they'd seen a dim light flickering in the distance, low to the ground, like a lantern swinging from an unseen hand. In February 1940, a minor earthquake struck the region. Though small in magnitude, it cracked the dried creek bed and exposed a patch of pale soil not far from the supposed Boardinghouse site. A local farmer reported that for several nights after, his livestock refused to approach the area. He later told the Iron County Register, "It's as though the ground there breathes slower than the rest." No further disturbances were recorded. But that spring, when county workers passed the same road repairing fence lines, they noted a single black rose blooming in the dust, rare for the region, darker than any local species. The foreman plucked it to examine later, but by evening it had withered to gray ash. Folklorists would later interpret this as embellishment, yet one worker's journal entry, dated March 17th, remains clear. There's no reason a flower should bloom where no seed was sown. Even nature, it seemed, played its part in preserving the widow's legend. The spring of 1941 brought renewed interest in the lost towns of southern Utah. Journalists and photographers, funded by the Works Progress Administration, roamed the desert to document abandoned settlements before they vanished completely. One of these journalists, Evelyn Morrow, made her way to the Parowan Basin, where old maps marked Juniper Creek, defunct. Her notes, later archived at the State Library, describe a quiet pocket of land scorched by wind and memory. Morrow wasn't hunting ghosts. She was searching for evidence of early domestic life on the frontier. Yet she could not ignore the widow's legend that still drifted through nearby farms. "Every household tells a version," she wrote. "Some claim mercy, others malice, but all agree she never left." Morrow's photographs, stark and sun-bleached, capture fragments of that emptiness, an old boot heel half buried in sand, a section of collapsed fencing, and what she identified as the outline of a cellar mouth covered by stones. In the corner of one frame, faint shadows appear across the ground, long, narrow, parallel, as though cast by unseen beams. Some later analysts, reviewing the negatives, noted that no such structures existed nearby to produce them. While developing her film back in Cedar City, Morrow recorded a curious experience in her travel log. The image of the well refuses to fix on the plate. Each exposure blurs the center, as if the photograph itself resists clarity. Despite multiple attempts, that particular frame remained fogged, an opaque patch in an otherwise clear roll. The defect, though likely chemical, became another small mystery added to the widow's archive. Meanwhile, an article appeared in the Salt Lake Journal that summer referencing the early Utah Territory and its strange frontier cases. Among them, the author listed The Widow of Juniper Creek as a parable of loneless sorrows, mistaken for sin. The tone was reflective, almost sympathetic. It painted Eliza Warren not as a killer, but as a product of grief, a woman who built her own prison and invited strangers to fill the silence. The article struck a chord with readers. Letters poured into the editor from older residents sharing fragments of family lore, stories of travelers who vanished down south, of a woman offering food to lost miners, of a place where the ground gave off warmth, even in the dead of winter. The editor summarized them in a follow-up column titled The Desert That Remembers. Among the letters was one from a retired preacher, claiming his father had ministered to a woman in mourning who confessed to sins too heavy for burial. He never named her, only noting that she wore a ring carved with the initials E.W. By the close of 1941, war headlines overtook such curiosities, and the story slipped again into obscurity. But within academic circles, Evelyn Morrow's photographs circulated quietly, proof that even a century later, something about that stretch of land defied documentation. A final annotation in her notebook reads simply, "The wind there sounds like breathing when it passes through the rocks." In 1942, as the world beyond Utah spiraled into war, the silence around Juniper Creek grew even deeper. Trains now thundered through the valleys far north of the Parowan Basin, and younger generations, busy with ration lines and military drafts, had little interest in the fading legends of the desert. Yet a few stubborn archivists refused to let the widow's story die. One of them was Harold Dunn, the same clerk who had first compiled the official file 3 years earlier. While reviewing land grants issued during the Utah Territory era, Dunn noticed an anomaly, a single deed stamped void, but never reassigned, listing the property under E. Warren and spouse J. Warren. The latter name had never appeared in any census. In the margin, a faint notation read, "Record held for investigation. Status unresolved. Feb. 1881." Intrigued, Dunn traced the record to a stack of territorial archives awaiting disposal. Among them, he found a water-damaged envelope containing a scrap of parchment, half legible, in a woman's script. "Let the guests sleep. The house must keep them." The handwriting, he confirmed, matched the signature found in the 1879 deed. It was the last verified trace of Eliza Warren in any state document. He shared his discovery with Evelyn Morrow, who by then had become known for her frontier photography. Together, they planned a small field visit in the spring of 1943, hoping to locate any remaining structure. Their correspondence survives in the Utah Historical Society's special collection. Morrow wrote, "It's strange how that name keeps returning, like a page the wind refuses to turn." They arrived on April 11th. By Morrow's account, the day was windless and clear, the sun low over the Parowan Hills. The pair located the creek bed easily, a shallow depression filled with brittle grass and stones. Dunn noted that the soil near the center was darker. Compacted and unnaturally cold to the touch. They uncovered a small section of brickwork, perhaps the remnants of a foundation, and beneath it, a rusted hinge fused to the earth. Morrow photographed everything. That night, they camped nearby, Dunn's journal from that evening contains an unsettling final entry. We heard movement under the ground, faint, but deliberate. Not water, not wind. I told Evelyn it was an echo from the soil settling, but it lasted too long. The next morning, their camp was intact, but Dunn's pocket watch had stopped at 3:17 a.m. He made note of it with mild amusement, though later wrote in the margin, "When the ground stirs, time itself hesitates." Morrow's photos from the trip were later developed and displayed in a small exhibit titled Echoes of the Frontier. One image, labeled simply Juniper Creek 1943, drew quiet attention. It shows the cracked foundation under dim morning light. But look closely, and a faint blur stands at the corner, shaped like a figure in black. Morrow claimed it was a trick of exposure. Dunn, however, never spoke of it again. He retired the following year and left his papers to the state. In his final note, attached to the Juniper Creek file, he wrote only, "Case closed by time, not truth." By 1944, the war had consumed nearly every headline, and domestic mysteries seemed trivial by comparison. Yet within Utah's quiet academic circles, the Juniper Creek file still passed from hand to hand, a relic from an era when isolation could be as dangerous as any battlefield. Students at the University of Utah's anthropology department used it as a case study in frontier psychology, citing both Harold Dunn's final note and Evelyn Morrow's haunting photograph. One professor, Dr. Helen Searle, published a short essay in the Western Historical Review titled Loneliness as Legacy, The Case of Eliza Warren. She approached the subject without sentiment, relying heavily on the surviving documents of the Utah Territory, and suggested that the widow's acts, if indeed she was responsible for any deaths, were not born of cruelty but of desperate preservation. Searle wrote, "She lived in a silence so complete that even guilt became company." The article was widely praised for its restraint, but it also revived local superstition. Letters flooded in from readers across Utah, each offering new sightings or inherited anecdotes. A miner's journal found in an attic, a wedding ring inscribed with E.W. discovered in a wash, or the report of a wagon driver whose team refused to pass an unmarked stretch of road near the old creek. None could be verified, yet every tale seemed to strengthen the legend's pulse. Meanwhile, Evelyn Morrow's 1943 negatives continued to intrigue. A laboratory technician in Salt Lake City, reviewing the originals for preservation, noted faint secondary images appearing on 2 frames. In one, the outline of the foundation wall contained a shadow that seemed to face the camera, sharper than before. In another, the blurred figure appeared closer. Experts attributed this to a double exposure, though Morrow insisted she had taken only 1 frame. "Perhaps the land developed itself," she joked to a colleague, though her diary later reveals unease. "Sometimes I feel I've photographed a memory that wasn't mine." That summer, she returned once more to the Parowan Basin. Her travel notes describe a simple ritual, placing a small bouquet of wild sage beside the cracked soil where the well once stood. "I thought it kind," she wrote, "to leave something living where nothing else remains." She stayed no more than an hour, yet the final entry in her notebook reads, "As I left, I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned, the wind stopped." Morrow lived another decade, never returning to the site. Her work, however, became quietly influential, not for the supposed haunting, but for the way it framed history itself as a ghostly presence. The widow of Juniper Creek became less a person than a question. How much of the past does the land agree to keep? And so, by the end of 1944, the legend settled again into its uneasy rest, part folklore, part file, suspended between paper and dust. Still, those who read the old records could not help but notice a pattern. Every 30 years or so, someone would return to Juniper Creek, and something beneath the soil would stir. The summer of 1945 marked the quiet centennial of the old Utah Territory, and historians across the state prepared exhibitions honoring its frontier past. Most focused on mining, railroads, or settlement diaries, but one small display in Salt Lake City, titled "The Desert That Kept Its Secrets," included a single, weathered photograph labeled Juniper Creek Boardinghouse, 1881, Artist's Reconstruction. The curator, perhaps aware of its dark reputation, placed it in a corner under dim light, beside a small placard that read, Origin Uncertain, Legend Persistent. Visitors lingered. Some swore the photograph's shadows seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, as though the light itself were remembering. A journalist covering the exhibit wrote in his column, "Few stories in Utah's history occupy such an uneasy space between record and haunting." Among those in attendance was a young historian named Daniel Searle, nephew of Professor Helen Searle. Intrigued by his aunt's work, he requested permission to review the Juniper Creek archives firsthand. The curator handed him Dunn's compiled file, a thin bundle of brittle papers and fading photographs tied with ribbon. One sheet caught his attention immediately, the ledger fragment recovered from 1881. Its ink, though faint, still read, "Let the guests sleep." Searle's field journal, later discovered among his belongings, recounts his growing fascination. He began tracing the timeline through remaining census data and property deeds, attempting to reconstruct Eliza Warren's origins. His notes suggest she may have come from southern Illinois, a widow by age 30, moving west during the mining migration of the 1870s. One annotation reads, "If she sought silence, she found it, and became it." In August of that year, Searle traveled south to visit the Parowan Basin, following Evelyn Morrow's old directions. The war had left gas scarce, and few ventured so far from town, but he was determined. His diary records the day's conditions precisely. Dry heat, air still, Juniper Creek nothing more than a scar in the earth. He camped by the basin's edge, just as Morrow and Dunn once had. That night, according to his final entry, the wind rose without warning. His handwriting turns uneven halfway down the page. Heard tapping. Thought it a branch, but there are no trees. Ground feels hollow again. The stars flicker, as if something moves beneath them. The next morning, a passing freight driver found the campsite deserted. Searle's camera and notes were intact. The only disturbance was a ring of dust around where he had slept, smooth, circular, perfectly measured, as though traced from below. Authorities concluded that he had wandered off in the heat and become lost in the desert. His body was never found. The disappearance of Daniel Searle marked the last documented event tied directly to the widow's story. With it, the legend closed another silent loop, right on schedule, 30 years after the last recorded visit. Scholars who later reviewed the case dismissed the coincidences as pattern-seeking. Yet, in the quiet of the archives, the Juniper Creek file remains marked with Dunn's original words, "Case closed by time, not truth." In the decades that followed, the desert slowly erased what little remained of Juniper Creek. The basin filled with sage and silence, the wind smoothing away every trace of foundation and fence. By the 1950s, no maps marked its existence. To most, it was as though neither the widow nor her boarding house had ever stood there at all. And yet among those who studied the early Utah territory, her name endured, not as criminal nor ghost, but as a symbol of the frontier's forgotten cost. Professor Helen Searle, now elderly, was once asked in a radio interview whether she believed the story of Eliza Warren was true. She paused for a long moment before answering. "True enough to leave a mark. The rest is between the earth and her." Her voice trembled slightly on the word earth, as though she still felt the weight of that silence buried under the Parowan sands. In 1953, when the state began cataloging lost towns for a centennial publication, Juniper Creek appeared only in a footnote. Probable settlement, circa 1870s-1880s. Location unconfirmed. The entry contained no mention of a widow, no boarding house, no disappearances. Yet locals near the basin claimed that during the driest summers, when the wind came from the south, they could hear what sounded like wooden steps shifting under the crusted soil, slow, even, deliberate. A few prospectors and hikers returned to the region in later years. Some reported faint indentations in the ground, shaped like a foundation's outline. Others swore they'd found fragments of porcelain or iron charred at the edges. None stayed overnight. One man, writing in a personal travel journal in 1961, described setting up camp near the old creek and waking to find his lantern burning low beside him, though he hadn't lit it. On the inside of the glass, someone had traced a single letter in soot, W, but perhaps the truest legacy of Juniper Cree lies not in these whispers, but in what it represents. Historians still cite the Utah Territory when teaching how isolation defined those who settled its harsh landscape. In its lonely valleys, people built homes against a silence so vast it sometimes answered back. The widow's boarding house, whether real or imagined, stands as the echo of that silence, a story too strange to die because it belongs to the desert itself. Even now, when storms sweep across the basin, the wind gathers around the same invisible spot where her house once stood. Travelers who pass say it feels colder there, as if the air has learned to remember. They turn away quickly, unwilling to linger, for in that stillness one can almost hear the faint rhythm of footsteps beneath the sand, patient, measured, and eternal. And so the story ends where it began, in Utah, in the shadow of forgotten years, where the widow's house has vanished, but her silence remains. The land keeps her secret, as it has for more than a century, closed by time but never by truth.